fish food, fish waste, detritus, things that build up. I talked to a gentleman who did his thesis on alkalinity. I like a high alkalinity because I like high growth rates in my tank. It makes me feel good when things grow fast. If you like things to grow fast, run a higher alkalinity in your system. He basically took an alkalinity in milliequivalents of 6, which is roughly, for those that don't know the conversion, up to around 17, 18 range. Had to keep the calcium down at 350, of course, because of the fact that once you go over 5 milliequivalents, you really suppress your calcium. So to avoid a milky tank, he just basically kept it at 350 parts. He then took another tank and ran it at natural seawater with a regular 400 to 450 calcium. He didn't really, concentrate on hitting an exact number. As long as it was in that range, he was fine. The growth rate from the 6 milliequivalents was 13 times more than the natural seawater. So you can see there is some benefit to running it higher. One caution I want to point out there that I've recently heard of, I've never tried it, are the bio pellets. If that system is what works and is good for you, do not raise your alkalinity over 3.5 milliequivalents. You will burn your coral. At least that's what I've heard. I have not personally tried it, but just remember that. Any type of new technology that you bring that's out there now, especially things like that, investigate, look into it. Don't just put it on your tank. I do know of one person that was in the club who got all up into the hype, and he runs his alkalinity higher. A few days after he placed it on his tank, he did notice corals, burning back, and immediately removed it. Not trying to bash it or say it, but just do your investigation. Know what you're putting onto your tank. It is a good system to use if you want to control nitrate, phosphates. If you have a lot of fish, just remember to lower your alkalinity. pH. pH is something that a lot of newer aquarists grab onto because they're used to that in their saltwater fish tank. There's problems with tracking your pH over alkalinity. One, if your pH is starting to get lower, usually your alkalinity is going to be low, because alkalinity is what is helping keep your pH stable and consistent. So you're basically kind of going backwards and checking. When that's a problem, then usually your alkalinity becomes a problem, and then you can run into problems with the fact that you're not catching things before they go wrong. pH also can be greatly affected by CO2 in the tank. With closed houses, most of the air conditionings out there do not bring in new air from outside. It just recirculates old air. And in Florida, this is a big common problem with the fact that CO2, your alkalinity is fine, but your pH you never can get up. So you start dumping in things to raise it. Big mistake, big mistake. You'll jack your alkalinity way up, and then you'll suppress your calcium, and ionically will disrupt the tank, and it will not fix the pH. You have a CO2 issue, chemicals will not fix it, it's oxygen. You put all the power heads in the world in your tank, and that is not the problem. It's the fact that the buildup of CO2 in your house that is the problem. And there is a very easy way to figure out if you do have a problem. Take a cup of water, test the pH, place the water outside the house, aerate it for 1 hour. If the pH goes up, especially over 0.2, then you know you have a CO2 issue in your house. At one of our meetings, in a 2,100 square foot tank, aquarists who loved to huddle and smother the tank because it was a nice tank, they had a pH probe on the system. After about 40-50 people being in the house for 3 to 4 hours, it went from a pH of 8 to 7.6. So you can see how CO2 can directly affect your pH, and if you're doing that as your measurement and not alkalinity, you may be testing and getting misled to think that you need to start dumping in buffers and then in turn disrupt your system. The The range we want generally is 8.0 to 8.4. If your house is closed in and that is an issue, really opening the doors, running your skimmer intake air outside is what's going to benefit you the most. Again, putting a bunch of power heads may seem like the logical thing to do, but is not actually what's going to fix the tank. In Florida, you're not going to catch me opening up my doors very much. So I do allow it to go a little bit lower and do what I can. Every once in a while I do hook that skimmer up to an air intake outside. I try not to get sporadic and let it run for, say, a week, just maybe let it run for a day or so just to help bring in. A lot of these skimmers, if you like big skimmers like me, will bring in a lot of CFM in a short period of time. 8.4 is the range that is best for calcification. It's a little bit more difficult to get up to 8.4 because generally things will balance out at an 8.3 range, and that's perfectly fine. Try not to chase numbers. I found that people that chase numbers, because sometimes test kits aren't as accurate as you would think. Like a standard aquarium calcium test kit, if it's off by 50 parts per million or less, that's in an acceptable range. So chasing numbers can get you into problems. Do not freak out. Things that happen good in aquariums generally do not happen fast. Things that happen wrong in aquariums generally happen fast. Magnesium. A lot of times I hear people say, oh, I fiddled with magnesium and it didn't help me. It was not that big of a deal. Really, magnesium, again, is one of those things that things happen slow. You do not want to raise your magnesium up high fast. You want to do it over weeks to a month time, depending on how low it is. If we look at magnesium in terrestrial plants, we already know that it is proven that it helps with absorption of elements and nutrients for the plant to grow. There was a Florida shrimp farm that basically, as you know, you're trying to crunch numbers and do things as cheap as you can but be effective. So they took saltwater shrimp and were trying to grow it in freshwater. They lived, they acclimated it to them, but in a short time they were dying because they weren't getting the proper amount of nutrition. They added magnesium to the water and brought it up. And sure enough, it turned around that they were able to keep and grow the shrimp and save a lot of money on not spending on keeping salt levels. There are a lot of issues on environmental. If you get your aquaculture license here in Florida, they do require you have a place to put your leftover seawater. They will not give you a permit if you do not have something. And basically what you do is have a big vat for evaporation, collect the salt, and then dispose of that properly, because they don't want all these people dumping all the salt water down the drains. SeaWorld pays a pretty penny for all their drainage because of that issue. And that is why they don't do as big of water changes as we all may and would like to see happen on their systems. But with their water treatment system, it's a lot more technical. There is a huge tank outside that they use for treatments, and that's another story that you can talk to from somebody from SeaWorld. Measurements we want are in parts per million. Range is 1250 to 1500. I urge you to stay away from the fact that when you mix up your salt, think that everything is fine. Even if you've tested that company before, salt companies change their formulas, and some of them change them very often. Every time there's a salt study out, it seems like somebody comes up and says, hey, well, I tested that same brand name and it doesn't give me the same numbers as what you're getting. That is because the formula did end up changing. I don't know if you know Randy Holmes Farley on Reef Central. He said he would never do a salt study because of that, because by the time his findings came out, the formula would most likely be changed, at least on one of them. But it's up to you to test it, to know it. There have been times where lots of salt have come in and been totally off due to mixing issues with their mixing facility. Sometimes brands of salt have had a large batch come out and people have lost several things. So be responsible. You know it, that it can be a problem, so just test it. Adjust it, bring it up to what you're keeping. Magnesium affects things osmotically, and that's why you want to bring it up slow, especially if you do a big water change. Those people that you hear out there that are scared of large water changes, they say it will kill your tank. I guarantee they did not address magnesium. They may have dosed their tank and eventually brought it up to where it was. They did a large change. Their salt, and a lot of salts can be low in magnesium because it's expensive. Because we're in the range of $12.50 to $1,500. Most people are used to seeing calcium at $400. So that's 3 or 4 times you're seeing